Good morning, folks. Hope you're having a great day today. Today, take a look at 10 of my favorite sort of short stories that I would consider in my Appendix N, my most influential fantasy stories of all time. The sort of inspiration for this story comes from Gygax. Gary Gygax, in the end of his first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, when he was creating the DMG and Dungeons and Dragons and stuff for people, he has an appendix in it called Appendix N. And Appendix N is very, very famous because what he does is he basically says, this is where Dungeons and Dragons and stuff came from. These are the short stories, these are the novels, these are for the writers, and so forth. And so he'll list them, and he'll also say, go to these guys if you're interested in getting some more ideas for your stories, for your world crafting, and so forth. And he also wants to go ahead and say, hey, look, which of these are actually the biggest? So he'll have this list of influences, but then at the end he'll have like 8 or 10 that are actually his best. He'll say, and of these works, here are the ones that were the most influential, and so forth. So you just need to kind of see where Gary Gygax thought that the most influential works were for his stuff. So I want to kind of do that too. Here are the 10 fantasy works that I would consider the most influential for myself, that I really loved, that I love going back to again and again, and that I would consider very resonant with me. Now, some of these are going to be strong pieces you will have heard of many times before, and sometimes not. And obviously for some of these pieces, I'll be giving you a little bit of my journey. Many of the people that I'll be giving to you may not necessarily be the biggest names in the world, and that's fine. That's who we are as people, as writers, as readers, and so forth. We are all influenced in different ways by the things that we read. And so when I really sort of explored my love of fantasy when I was a kid, in high school and so forth, I turned myself to a lot of fantasy writers, including ones that were being published during that day, and some big name ones too. And while I liked some big ones like Ian McCaffrey's Dragon series, or the Dragon Riders of Pern, Dragon Song series, and so forth, or I liked A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin, or I would read some random stuff like Richard A. Knack's, and so forth. At the end of the day, these are the 10 pieces that stuck with me. Some of these are going to be bigger names, and some of these are going to be lesser names. But again, I thought it would be fun for you to kind of take a look. And then at the end, I'd love to talk about you unpacking your kind of Appendix N. What would you, in terms of fantasy, what would you consider your 10 sort of really sort of works out there, or and writers out there that are really sort of pivotal to help you sort of influence yourself and so forth? So start with my number 10. My number 10 is The Complete Book of Swords by Fred Saberhagen. Fred Saberhagen wrote some famous works in fantasy and science fiction. In fantasy, this is probably his best well-known work. In fantasy, in science fiction, rather, I'm sorry, it's the Berserker series. And this would probably be considered probably his favorite famous fantasy work. Some of this stuff actually appears on Gary Gygax's Appendix N, The Empire of the East. This is actually set in the same world. All right, so one of the things that Fred Saberhagen is trying to do in this story, which is set, which he wrote in the late 70s and the early 80s, but basically it's set in the world that he wrote, Empire of the East, that again was hugely influential, post-apocalyptic world and so forth. And basically what he's going to do is, in the first book and in the first introductory page, you're going to get a chance to see all the different gods that are in the world, and the gods, and one of their gods, Vulcan, is going to create a set of 12 swords, and these 12 swords are going to basically be given and sprinkled across the world, and the idea is there's these super powerful swords that people are going to quest for, grab, change lives, and so forth. So it's going to be a fun thing to mix things up and help the gods not be bored and stuff. So that's what's going to happen. Now it's fun. You're going to get a chance to kind of see some of these different swords. Each of these swords is very different, from Talon Saber to Doomgiver to Shield Breaker and so forth, Wound Healer, and there's the 12 sort of epic strong swords. The idea of swords in sort of a fantasy setting was not something that he'd done, but I think he kind of really brings it to the table with these 12 separate swords. Each of them have sort of different things, and so forth. And some of them will attack the mind, some will attack the body, some of them will be a perfect defense. You can't get through them. Cough, Doom, Giver, Cough, and so forth. One of them you can twirl it around and say, for thy heart who has slayed me, and Farslayer will jump out of your hand and kill the person who's your greatest enemy immediately, no matter where they are. But the sword stays there, so the person next to him can pick it up and do it again, and so forth. You guys can kill each other. It's really fun, and so forth. So there's a lot of these. Each of these swords is different, and has a different character and a flavor to them, and so forth. And so the story is going to be very epic, as these different swords sort of enable different armies and leaders and bad guys and good guys to do things, and save things and so forth. And we'll end with this big giant battle in the third book. It has an epic scale, despite the fact that it has this sort of 12 sword setup. And I think that the idea of these various swords as when I was growing up, was something I found to be very, very sort of fun, and I found the world building to be very evocative, and so forth. All these different gods from these different pantheons and so forth. They're all sort of involved from human pantheons during history. So you get this kind of pan-human pantheon. Again, Vulcan, because he creates the swords, is going to be the major character, but there could be other ones out there too. But I consider it to be very influential. In fact, I would actually go and write stats for these for various games. I've introduced them, these 12 swords, and so forth. I really love this this collection of 3 stories. Now, he did go back afterwards. He'll go back to the world and he'll write other sort of follow-ups to this. But there you go. That's Fred Saberhagen's Book of Swords, and that's going to be the number 10 thing on my list. So let's take a look at the number 9. All right, so the number 9 is going to be the Drizzt Do'Urden series by R.A. Salvatore. Now, when I was growing up, this was my favorite series, and he was my favorite writer after I found him, and so forth. I loved this. I thought it was great. And he wrote at the same time, and he grew up as a writer while I was reading him, and I grew up as a reader too. And so I'm always going to have a soft spot in my heart for him. If you look at my bookshelf, you're going to see like tons of Salvatore books. Up through about the early 2000s, I had every single book he wrote, and I read them all. There would be a time when I'd sort of dial out of the continuing Salvatore stuff, and so forth. But I still have a soft spot in my heart for him and so forth. I thought that this was great stuff when I was growing up. And again, for about 3 or 4 years, he's my favorite writer, until I went to college, until my first year in college, when I switched over. And we'll talk about my next writer later on. He's actually going to be my number 1 person later on. But one of the things I really like about the sort of Salvatore stuff is that he has sort of gravitas. It's fun stuff. It's interesting stuff. A lot of it fun. It has an epic feel to it, and so forth. He can also write a combat scene better than probably anybody else has ever really read, and so forth. So there's a lot of things out there that he does well as a writer. He also creates the character of Drizzt Do'Urden, which for anybody out there who's reading fantasy or playing video games or role-playing games or anything like that during the era, you would have known who Drizzt Do'Urden is because everybody wanted to be him, and so forth. He was this iconic character for a generation. So, R.A. Salvatore is very good. Now, the reason why he doesn't hit higher on my chart, even though I still have, like I said, a soft spot for him to this day and so forth, is that now that I've gone and read a lot more fantasy works, what he did was he basically just took, I don't know if he did this knowingly or not, but he basically just combined 2 separate major character tropes in fantasy work. One of those was the Aragorn type of the noble ranger that Tolkien kind of creates in The Lord of the Rings, and so forth, and then he becomes this sort of this major sort of mythical ranger. And then the other one is Elric, the Woman Slayer, from Michael Moorcock's works. And in that one, Elric is born the prince of this nasty, evil empire of non-human, powerful, magical creatures, which very similar to Dark Elves, and he has a conscience. Now, he's not as fully developed a conscience as Drizzt does. He's not afraid to his sword will drain people's lives. He'll drain people's lives so he can after he kills them in order to power himself up so he can take out the bad guys. He's not, he understands that there's, he's not as good as I think Drizzt would be. Drizzt probably would never do that. He would never, he'd never take out the bad guys by hurting good guys. But he understands that there's that in order to take out the bad guys, you have to sometimes, sort of do some things you prefer not to. And he will do so pretty easily on the conscience, and so forth. But this idea of this brooding, dark, guy who was born with a conscience from a people that don't have one and are just an infamous race of magical non-human creatures. That's it's Drizzt Do'Urden basically is combining Elric and Aragorn into one character. He's a noble, fun ranger who also is from a dark race who's never been understood, right, and born with a conscience from this evil race of. It's basically just taking those 2 tropes and combining them into one character. It worked. He got the New York Times bestseller list and so forth. And again, I still have a soft spot for it. But now that I've read more fantasy and see he just took 2 tropes that already existed and put them into one character. And again, I don't know that he did that knowingly or not, but he did. He just combined Elric and Aragorn. Again, I appreciate that he did that and it worked. And again, it still speaks to me, but it's no longer one of my top 5 or my number 1 or anything like that. It's fallen a little bit since I sort of realized that in college and so forth, and thus he kind of no longer was my number 1 writer. Other people hit my number 1 spot and so forth as I became more read in the genre and so forth. But again, I still have a soft spot for him. He's still something I would consider personally very influential to me as a person, and so I would consider in my fantasy sort of journey, and so he would hit my number 9 spot on my Appendix N. So now let's turn to number 8. So my number 8 spot is going to be the first trilogy in the Dragon Slayer Chronicles. And this one's going to be the Dragons Chronicles, Dragons of Spring Dawning through Dragons of Winter Night, and then Fall. It's going to be here too. And basically the idea of this is going to be, this is by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, is this trilogy. And this kind of will create a brand new Dragonlance world, and so forth, that the IP of Magic, that had all the sort of magics and dragons and so forth from Dungeons & Dragons and TSR, they're going to have a new world. And so they created this trilogy in order to kind of set it up so you could get a chance to get a feel for it and so forth. And I definitely think that the best part of the world that they created is the fiction that's set in the world. It's not the gaming that's set in the world, which has been one of the weirder sort of things I think came out of Dragonlance. Is that I think its books are a whole lot better than anything else that's written there. Game design, characters, modules, and so forth. This is, I feel like, the and one of the reasons is because the modules don't give you any sort of player. You as a player can't do anything. You have this short story that you're shoehorned into as part of these plots and these books and so forth. So it's hard for you to do anything. You go off the script, you can't do it. And so forth. In order to help support modules, there are a couple of places in the series where I think it's like a little weird. Like they'll go to a tower where there's a white dragon, and they'll come back after in the book, and then they'll come back having figured it out because there's a module set in there. So you'll do the module as a person if you enjoyed it. There's another place where they will go and find this ancient hammer, the Hammer of Karas, and give it to this Dwarven Kingdom so they could pass through their gates and move to where they're wanting to go. That also, they'll just immediately start to having given it. They won't have that as a part of the story at all. So there's a couple of times where I think the story, could have been more fleshed out, and the world could have been better by not making those modules, but making those a part of the story, and so forth too, because this is the strongest part of the Dragonlance story, so forth. It's going to be the first time that TSR, a lot of things are going to be sort of wed to a game world. This idea of fiction, which I think is going to do better too. And like I said, my number 9 was also another example of that with the Forgotten Realms stuff. Anyway, but I really like the series. These two writers together, Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, do I think a great job of character design and character build up. It's fast to read. It's a lot of things that happen. It's very detailed and intricate, and the characters I think play very well with each other. And there's some internecine fighting and so forth. There's within the party and other people. So I think there's a lot of things that happen. They understand the people as characters rather than just tropes. And so I think it's well written. And I liked it a lot. In fact, I actually followed these writers during their career through like the Dark Sword trilogy, the Gate trilogy with 7 books. That's all like Earth, Wind, and so forth, and all those. So I do enjoy some of the things that they did after this, and the stuff they would come back to with it, like the Twins trilogy, the sequels to it that are set a future generation when they destroy the world and so forth. So I do enjoy some of the later stuff that they're going to do too. But I really think that as a duo of writers, this trilogy, I think, begins to set the stage for them as a set of writers, and I follow them throughout the rest of their career. But I also think that this trilogy in and of itself is also a great trilogy too. It's also I consider it to be the best trilogy because it's not bound by anything. They can just let it be itself. Then later on, when you're doing sequels, prequels, sidequels, right, and you're following the stories of minor characters who have tiny little bit pieces in here, like Theros Ironfeld. Now there's a Theros Ironfeld novel and so forth. It can be a little much. And there's 15,000 sequels and prequels and so forth. And then things that are set like hundreds of years in the past will tell the story of Huma or something like that, and the Cataclysm. They're there, and I get that the world was so beloved that everyone wanted to come back and kind of flesh it out and put their own story to it and so forth. So I get that, and I understand where that's coming from. But at the same time, I also Come on now. But anyway, but this first trilogy, though, it's itself. The writers can basically just do what they think is appropriate for the storyline, for the world that they've created, and so forth. And I really appreciate that. And again, it's a big hit, and I definitely would say it's a strong story. And again, it was something that really stayed with me, and I would consider it impactful to me. So I give it my number 8 spot. The first trilogy in the Dragonlance Chronicles, I would give my number 8 spot on my Appendix N. All right, so now let's turn to number 7. Now, number 7 is going to be, in a similar way to that, it's going to be a first series. In this case, it's only 4 series. It's the Lords of Dust series by Lawrence Watt Evans. And he writes the first one. This is the first book he ever wrote, and he's just sent it off to Del Rey. And they published it, and it's called the Lord of the Basilisk. The Lord of the Basilisk is the worst of this trilogy by far. And in the second book, The Seven Altars of Dusara, if I had to pick one book out of this would be the one I choose by far. This is the best book of the series by far. It's so good. It's so much better. You can tell how much he improved as a writer from this book to this book. This book is just a fun book. It's not something that's going to stay with you. There's not a whole lot in it. The characters are fun. The world's okay, and so forth. This is just a fun little fantasy book. But it's the rest of the series when it starts to pick up the pace, particularly, like I said, with the second book in the series. And then the third books are going to be sort of Behilu, and then the Book of Silence closes out the story. And basically the idea is that you're going to be showing this character, it looks like it starts out as a traditional fantasy world, and your main character is Garth, who's an overman who has 2 opposable thumbs, taller than a man, doesn't have a nose, and so forth, and so he's a very different sort of character. And he's kind of one of the leaders of it, and he's going to be coming to this forgotten king, this yellow king, and he's going to be getting some information from him, following a quest for him, the first book. And then he's going to continue to follow quests for the king, because the wise women of his kingdom told him to go visit him and seek his counsel for some of the things that are happening back home. And so basically what you're going to do is you're basically all 4 of these stories, well, the third one not as much, but he's going to be following quests for the forgotten king, and the king in yellow, and so forth. And thus he will be doing a bunch of those quests. Now in the first book, again, he's just going to finding a basilisk and bringing it back. It's not a major issue, and so forth. The second one, much better. Basically, what the Forgotten King is going to do is he's going to tell Garth to go to the city of Dusara and pull and then bring him back what's on each of the 7 altars of Dusara. Now, Dusara is basically the land of the 7 lords of Deuce, which are the sort of the evilish gods of the era and so forth, and the city that he's going to be going to is the area that they're in. Now, basically, he's going to be living in the era of one of the gods. You're going to find out more about that. He's actually living in the era of the 5th god, the god of decay, and the first 4 gods of evil have already had their turns. And basically, as each god goes through more and more and more, and so forth. So the next era then would be the god of destruction, who's the second most powerful of the evil gods, and then the last era will belong to the god of death, who is obviously going to be the most powerful of them, and so forth. And that'll be the era of death, and then afterwards, nobody knows what's going to happen. So, in the 7 altars of Dusara, he's basically going to set up everything. You're going to see who the characters are, who the gods are, what's actually been happening behind the scenes, and so forth, what Garth's role in that is going to be, what the king's role in that is going to be, and so forth. So and the Forgotten King, the one in yellow who sent him out. You're going to find out who all these people are, what's actually happening, and so forth in this book. And it's an incredibly strong book. It has always stayed with me. I've loved going back to it. But I consider, again, this second book to be the real true classic. And then the 3rd and 4th book, too, that will continue to follow that story, and so forth. So if you want to, you can kind of see the Lure of the Basilisk as a prequel, and then a trilogy afterwards, instead of a series of 4. I think that would not be a poor way of seeing it, and so forth. But that's the Lords of Dust series. It's incredibly strong, incredibly evocative. I enjoy all the various things that happened with it. It's probably the story I read as a child, and that stuck with me the longest. Many of the other things we're going to be reading moving up forward were things more in my teens or strong later on, or college, and so forth, that have really kind of stayed with me and hit me as stronger stuff, or when I was going out there. But this is, I consider it probably to be the one that I read that really kind of stuck with me, because I really do like the world building that's involved, and what ends up happening and so forth with that. So I think it's pretty strong. That's Lawrence Watt Evans's, that's my number 7 choice. Now my number 6 choice. So my number 6 choice is going to be Bram Stoker's Dracula. And why I like Bram Stoker's Dracula, this might seem a little bit out there for some of you folks, is Bram Stoker's Dracula truly a fantasy work? Well, I think it is. And I think it is for a few reasons. First of all, because it's written from a fantasy viewpoint. For example, take Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a science fiction work. In fact, it's one of the first science fiction works out there. It has a scientist who has figured out a way to animate life and create it again. He's written as a science fiction story. In the near future, scientist who's a biochemist and so forth has figured out this process that while he's in college that he can use to recreate life in a sort of animate form. It's a science fiction story. Now it has horror elements to it for modern readers, but it's not written like that, and it's not read like that by people today if you go back and read it, which I've talked about actually quite a bit. If you want to check out my video to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I can go ahead and hit you up with that. But in the meantime, I would consider Dracula is very different. The answers to Dracula aren't scientific in nature, they're fantastic in nature. Faith in a cross, sacred wafers in sacred earth will remove his ability to be able to sleep in it. It's stuff like that. It's more of a fantasy story rather than, so it's a fantasy horror rather than a science fiction horror. So that's why it's my number 6 choice on this list. Now, again, Bram Stoker is, as a writer, I think he's not the best writer in the world, but what he does is he brings this sort of strong character, a flavor of world building, and it's about the world with Dracula. It's not necessarily about the things that are happening. One of the things that really suited the story really well is he chose to write this as a series of journal letters, diary entries, and recordings by Dr. Seward in terms of audio on records and so forth. And so by recording it as these series of these personal but different people in the story, but their own personal recollection, he has it as a limited third-person view each time out and so forth. He also will have a couple of like newspaper clippings and so forth that they'll collect and put in too. But the idea again is that you're getting a chance to feel for the world as these people are experiencing it and telling you what ended up happening. Now, because it's a strong story, you probably know what's going to happen. He's going to come back. One of the people's going to die. She's going to get Rosen as a vampire. They're going to have to kill her, which makes everybody really unhappy. Then they're going to have to figure out who he is, chase him down, and so forth. Once they kick him out of London, he's going to flee back home to Transylvania. They're going to follow him. And then once they get back to Transylvania, they got to take him out on home turf. One of them will die in that process, and that's it. That's the end of the story. Now, I normally wouldn't do a spoiler or review like that, but it's not like anybody doesn't know what happens in the story. But again, because of the things that happen, it's interesting. But again, it's a fantasy version of the story. And here's how you know it's a fantasy. Lots of people who have come to this story later have tried to science fictionize it. They'll say, hey, the reason why garlic works is because, when you're becoming a vampire, you have an allergy to garlic. And so it's hyperallergic or something like that. Like Blade, for example, who'll come to this story and the writers and try to scientize the story. Why is it? And so forth. But it's not written like that. That's, it's written as a fantasy. These are things that will work on these, these are creatures that are coming back from the undead. That is a fantasy trope, right? And then, hey, look, you can't take them out with, like science. So forth, you got to take them out with magical stuff, like, magical items that have been blessed by a god, or, something like that, or garlic, that's basically like your herb that can take out stuff. It's not, or exposing them to the sun, although exposing them to the sun in this book just removes their power. They're still just a normal powered human. So they won't like automatically die or anything like that. Just so you know. But again, it's a fantasy story, not a science fiction story, and thus it's my number 6 choice. It's also probably the book that I've had at my number 1 spot the longest for my favorite novel. I've loved it so much when I read it the first time, and it stayed with me, and I still go back and read it multiple times, although it's no longer my number 1 book. But again, it's something that was very strong, very evocative, and so forth. And again, I think it's such a well-written story, even though the writer, Bram Stoker, isn't somebody who I'm going to go to the mattresses for and say, this is a great writer. But the story was well written, and because of that sort of first person narrative, it really kind of sticks with you and sinks with you. It feels more realistic, I think, than if you just been writing it from a kind of third person omniscient sort of viewpoint and so forth. So I think he chooses the right way to tell the story, and so forth. So that's Dracula by Bram Stoker. Again, that's my number 6 choice for what I would consider my 6 most compelling sort of thing that stuck with me. Now, the first one of these in my top 5 is going to be Conan the Barbarian by Robert Howard. Now, I'm actually not, I'm going to give you the spot to Robert Howard, but I'm actually going to tell you why it's not actually Howard. It actually would have been the Conan the Barbarian media, specifically the Savage Sword of Conan series. But I'm giving the spot to Howard, who kind of influenced it and so forth. But for Robert E. Howard and his creation of Conan the Barbarian is very strong. Conan the Barbarian is obviously a character that people will know from fantasy and so forth, films, and so forth. My first experience with it was when I was a kid growing up in southern West Virginia. My local store sold comics, and they actually sold a Savage Sword of in addition to normal comics. I don't think they realized that that wasn't comics code appropriate. But one of the first comics I actually bought, and my first Conan comic ever, was actually in the Savage Sword line, because I didn't realize that either as a kid. And it's in black and white. It's more artistic. The story is much more dark, visceral. It may have more blood, more violence. It was the only one of the only comics at the time that wasn't in the comics code, and approved for the comics code. It was really meant more for adult readers and so forth. The story was dark too, and you know, and it goes to a dark place. And I thought that this was such a strong story, and so forth. And I loved it, and I've been a fan of Conan ever since. And I still stand by that. I still think that was probably one of my favorite Savage Sword of Conan comics. I've gone back and probably picked up more than 100. Read a bunch of them. There's also a bunch of trades on my shelf if you were to take a look and see some of the trades for some of the early ones. As I also enjoy lots of other Conans, for everything from the Howard stuff, to more later comics and stuff like Roy Thomas. I also love the Kurt Busiek series that he did for Conan. So I just really enjoy Conan. He's definitely somebody who sat with me. I really enjoyed the world that Howard created and so forth. And I've obviously gone back and read all the Howard stuff. I've read every single Howard story on Conan. I have like a 4-volume collection on my shelf to prove it. So I really enjoyed it. But I came to Conan not from Howard and then looked at the rest of this world, but from the opposite direction. But it's still something that stuck with me. I still consider it very, very powerful stuff. His strong world building, strong characters, and so forth. He did lots of adventure that happens there too. It also has less of a. It's more of a fantasy with a lot of sort of fantasy trappings of like wizards, necromancers, and so forth. While that's certainly there, he also writes it with a sort of a sense of awe and so forth, with just like normal creatures and so forth, which I like. And so it's got kind of a low fantasy feel to it, which again is a world that I also think is pretty cool too. So that's it. That's Robert Howard's Conan, and that's my number 5 spot on my sort of the things that really sort of influenced me and sort of stick with me to this day. So now let's take a look at my number 4. Now my number 4 may be one that you might be controversial, and that's fine. I don't think it'll be more controversial than Dracula. It's a fantasy story. Although again, Dracula's a fantasy story. But my number 4 is going to be Gygax, and I'm going to be showing you a couple of his books from his first edition book. And so forth. But Gary Gygax really sort of puts fantasy on a map. He codifies it. He brings a lot of sort of writers and brought them all together. Modern fantasy is, we are now living in Gygax's world, and we should just understand and recognize it. Modern fantasy has been changed permanently by Gary Gygax's pen and so forth, and the works that he created. And even though he would regularly take things from other works and put them into his things, he still wrote enough new stuff and so forth, and codified a lot of things. And he would bring things from like history, from mythology, and so forth to the modern era and so forth. And he does that, I think, in such a strong way that we just have to kind of clap our hands and say, good job, Gygax. And a lot of the things that he creates, his idea of the alignment system is still in modern fantasy, even things outside of gaming, and so forth. So, for example, R.A. Salvatore's works in the Crystal Shard, one of the characters that's in here was actually the second book. Artemis Entreri was intentionally created as a lawful evil antagonist, which is an alignment term that you'll understand if you're familiar with Gygax. Similarly, one of the characters in here, Regis, who's a halfling, is chaotic neutral. He's not good. He doesn't do anything that's good in the storyline, and so forth. He's not, other than helping out his friends, he's not going to do anything that's particularly good, and so forth. So again, you're getting this feel for these characters from an alignment setting that Gygax created, even outside of a gaming context. And you're seeing that again and again and again. And so you're getting everything from the things that he brought up from like ancient sort of works from the Middle Ages and their mythologies and so forth, all the way to modern tropings and so forth. So I would consider Gygax thus to be an incredibly influential person on who I am as a person. I would consider him my fourth strongest fantasy influence in my Appendix N too. And that's why I'm doing my Appendix N in his homage, because I put him at my number 4 spot. So let's take a look at my top 3. So my number 3, what I would consider to be kind of my number 3, my Appendix N, most influential for me, is going to be Fire on the Water, and in fact the entire Lone Wolf series. This is the only thing you're going to see on here that's actually written for kids, rather than something that is written for adults. So, sorry. But again, you're going to get a chance to see it here. This is a children's games book series. And because it's a game book rather than a book that you would read, that's where I think people might say, why did you choose this? But if I just chose Dungeons & Dragons, the creative Dungeons & Dragons, I think I could certainly choose this as my number 3 choice, which actually has created a world. And in this, basically, what you're going to get a chance to take a look at Joe Dever's world, and the world that he creates, Magnamund, and so forth. And one of the things that you're going to get a chance to feel in it, everything from while it feels like a traditional fantasy world, everything in it was his own creation. Take as an example, the world that he created in here, Magnamund. He's not going to be putting in any orcs, there's no elves, and so forth. Those sorts of things don't exist. They're still undead, but there aren't like traditional sort of skeletons and zombies and liches and stuff like that you might find in previous sort of sources. He has this entire world, and it's populated with creatures that he created himself, which is really, really cool. And it was a big, he took on a big project and so forth. He wrote this, and it was a big hit, and sold a lot. And the game book series that he actually wrote, the Lone Wolf series, has more than 20 books in it now. Actually, it hits up to 30, and so forth. And I really enjoyed some of the other things that he published in that world too. For example, he has a book called The Magnamund Companion, which I picked up when I was a kid, too, which kind of gives you maps of the world, outlines all the countries in the world and so forth. It's really fun to kind of take a look at the behind the scenes things that were happening, and so forth. There's also some other series that'll be written in there. There's another series too that's written in the southern part and kind of begins to flesh that out. It's a 4-book series. And so forth. But again, the world building that happens here is very strong. The opportunity to kind of come into a world that has fallen to darkness more and more, and you are beginning at the darkest point. You start the first book as this member of this order of people called the Kai. They're basically just psychic rangers that protect this country that's right next to the bad guys. It's basically the Gondor of the world. And you're right next to the big giant bad guys that are the Dark Lords and so forth. And your major group of heroes that helps you protect them has fallen right before in the first passages of the first book, and you are the only one that has survived this extinction of your defense and your people and who is training you and so forth. And you're just this young initiate. What do you do? That sort of idea is a very strong one, and so from the very first passage, the world that Dever creates is just intoxicatingly strong, and he challenges you as a reader with his world building, and so forth. So the first book, you're going to go and tell the king what happened, and that's so he'll know that all the Kai except for you have passed, and so forth. The second book, he's going to go send you next door to the allies, and they're going to be kind of like play a row and row. Go grab this sword that we've got and bring it back, because we're being besieged now by the bad guys, and the bad guys have come out, and they're taking us out, and it's not good at all. And they've attacked, they've launched wars and so forth, and it looks like we're going to fall. And so you're going to go back there and try to bring back a fleet that's going to come back and take them out, and so forth. And you'll get this ongoing story. The third book, okay, now what? Now that we've pushed them aside, now what? Well, we got this traitor who betrayed us to the bad guys. Let's go track him down in Vonatar. I want you to go track him down, take him out, and so forth. So you have this ongoing story, and each one of these builds on the story of the world in a very compelling way. And while there are one or two that I kind of think aren't as good, I think book 7, The Castle of Death, is in my mind the weakest of the first 12, because it doesn't add very much world building to the world, and it's just basically a big giant dungeon crawl. But again, there are these many different things, and it's just such a strong storyline that he weaves that you're a part of during this. And I still go back to it and read it. You can also read these, by the way. Joe Dever did a great thing. He actually, later on in his life, as the internet got started, he actually created an online version. So you actually go and read all his books, every single thing that he ever wrote on Project Aeon. I'll actually link you to that in the comments below because it's just so well done if you want to check it out and so forth. So you can actually go read these yourself. And you don't have to have these things. You don't have to spend a single dollar for it and so forth. Although he did write some special versions of these books that were kind of collector's versions that may fix some of the issues with some of them, or codify some of the issues, or make some things more clear when there's rules-based questions from readers. What if I combine this and this? Is that fine? And so forth. So later on, he'll add rules to some of the later books, and he'll introduce those to earlier books in his newer versions so you can go out there and buy collector's editions if you want to support him and so forth. Unfortunately, he recently died and so forth, but he was somebody who loved his fans and his works so much he was willing to share them for free after he had gotten, a little bit of money early on in his life. But he wasn't somebody who was like super rich or something, or had it made. And I really appreciate that about him. He was really a down-to-earth writer and so forth. And also the illustrator who also did this stuff too, Gary Chalk, is an incredibly strong illustrator. Let me see if I can just show you one or two of his pieces in here. Yeah, here's one. Here's an example. So you can get kind of a feel for who Gary Chalk is. He's this very, very strong black and white illustrator who really has a good sense for the world and world building and so forth. So again, that's my number 3 choice. Again, it might be controversial, but I think the world building he does, the story he has and so forth, I think that once you start getting engaged with it, any sort of pushback would be a non-starter because it's just so strong. But let's go ahead and take a look at my number 2. Now my number 2 is going to be, I doubt it will be a surprise. Some people might wish it was number 1, but it's not going to be. That's not where it belongs in my own list. But this will be my second most influential, and my Appendix N, and that's Tolkien. We're going to take a look at The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings that followed it, the 4 books. And so forth. And I would consider this to be my second most influential work of all time. Tolkien, obviously, is Tolkien. Not much I could say that you probably won't know as a reader. If you're watching this channel, you'll at least watch the movies, even if you haven't gone back and read the stuff it was based on. At least, moving forward, if you're watching a channel like this, and so forth. He was very strong. He took a lot of the sort of things that he was studying in his classes and putting together as a writer. And to create his world and so forth. So it's very Norse in feel, and so therefore a lot of sort of fantasy that's followed has also felt Norse. He created tropes like Aragorn, like Rangers and so forth that are still in the world today. The reforging of the fantasy sword that he took from these sort of famous works and brought them in and so forth. So there's a lot of these sort of things that he has. It's a very strong, very mythic feel to it. He's really the first one to codify this sort of plane-wide battle between good and evil, that our heroes are going to be able to push one way, and thus the good guys win when they were about to lose, and so forth. It's that sort of first one. That's going to be a very common trope for these sort of epic fantasy works to follow, and so forth. So he creates so many different things. It's such a strong writer. And so forth. I read it when I was in 5th grade. I read The Hobbit when I was in 5th grade, and then I read the Lord of the Rings in the summer between my 5th and 6th grade years. And I really grew up as a reader during that time, and so forth. It was great stuff. So I really appreciate who he was and the world building that was in it. The Hobbit's very different. The Hobbit was published like in the 30s. But the real trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, isn't published until the 50s. But it wasn't like The Hobbit was this huge hit, and then everybody was clamoring for where's the rest of this story. It wasn't until the 50s, after the mid 50s, after he published The Lord of the Rings, that his stuff and his works and himself are really on the map in a major way. And so there's actually a number of fantasy works that are very important and influential that are kind of pre-Tolkienian and read very differently than post-Tolkienian stuff. And so it's kind of interesting and kind of read what would have been if we hadn't had Tolkien, and how these writers like Jack Vance or something like that, Fritz Lieber, how their fantasies have kind of evolved over time. Where would we be today? I think it's an interesting question. But anyway, that's obviously J.R.R. Tolkien. I don't need to spend too much time on because everybody there knows who he is and why he's there. The only pushback I might get is, why is he number 1? Because it doesn't deserve that spot. So let's take a look at my number 1. Number 1 is going to be one of my favorite writers of all time. It's Michael Moorcock. I'm going to choose his entire Eternal Champion series because I really do think that his entire Champion series was that influential on me as a person. But I had specifically pointed to the Hawkmoon series, which I consider the easiest to pick up. If you're not familiar with any of his things, I also consider it the most traditionally fantasy of his stuff too. Michael Moorcock, I've talked about a few things sometimes. He's written so many different things. Probably his best known characters, Elric of Melniboné, with the sword Stormbringer and its twin Moonblade and so forth. And so he has this very much a strong sort of world building. And basically what he does is he's created the multiverse. And by the way, he's the first person he coined the term the multiverse. But all these different planes where there is this battle between law and chaos. And in this battle between law and chaos, one of the things that's happening is you have this eternal champion who's basically an incarnation of the same person on every plane of existence. So the person that you're reading on Hawkmoon, and that battle is distinct from the battle that's taking place in Elric of Melniboné, but Elric is also that eternal champion. Similarly, you have Corum, who's also one of those champions. Ericos is one of those champions, and so forth. And there's a number of them, all the Von Becks. And so there's obviously a big number of these sort of core characters out there that are very much these eternal champions and sort of iterations of the same character. I like that idea. First of all, I think it's one that fleshes out to me. Each of the worlds can be different, yet still have these sort of same tropes, and it feels appropriate to the story. Also, he'll regularly have some dark things that happen. For example, in his first novel, in the 50s, he'll have a human who's sent to a world where he wakes up and he finds himself in the battle of the last days between humans and elves, and he's going to push. Because he's a human, he's going to join the battle for humans and so forth, and he pushes himself further and further and further, and to extinction of the elves. And because the elves have these ancient weapons they're not going to use, they're basically like nuclear weapons, I guess, or something like that. And so forth. Ultimately, he captures some elves, realizes they aren't as bad as he thought they were, falls in love with some elves and so forth. He actually joins the elf side, and he'll actually get them to launch the ancient weapons and convince them to do so, and he'll actually wipe out his own race. That's how dark. Wipes out his own race. That's Michael Moorcock. And he'll actually play that trope again with Elric and some other stuff too. So he's not kidding around. Right? Let's say he's much more darker. It's that. And so anyway, that's who Moorcock is as a writer. And he's actually seen as a literary figure in his home of Britain. That's somebody who's transcended the genres. And he's the first one to write. He's also the first one to write cyberpunk novels and so forth. So he actually created the cyberpunk genre and so forth. So hugely influential from a number of different angles and so forth. I'm choosing Hawkmoon as my series to point to. Again, it's set in the future, in a future Earth and so forth, where you're going to be fighting up against this great empire that's set in Great Britain. I think it's an easy one to enter in, unto, even though it's got some future technology in it rather than normal stuff in it, but it still kind of feels like a fantasy story, and so forth. I consider those 4 books that are in that series to be pretty fun. They're each pretty quick breeze and so forth. And like I said, this is a 4-volume thing. And Michael Moorcock, like a lot of writers of his day, is not going to spend a lot of time on a book. His books are going to be like 100 and some pages, and so forth. You can get through. You could read a book a day and get through this thing if you wanted to. Each of the books are probably going to be 100 and some pages in that story. Anyway, so that's Michael Moorcock, and again, I would consider his whole Eternal Champion to be my top choice. But again, but I'm pointing to the Hawkmoon because I think that's probably the easiest one to get started with. It's also the one that's in Gary Gygax's Appendix N. He actually lists the Hawkmoon series as Michael Moorcock's section. So anyway, those are my 10 I would consider most influential things that have stuck with me after I've read them, gone back to them, expanded my own reading of those worlds after I read some of my first books and so forth. I'd love to hear more about what your own would be, what you consider your top 10 works in fantasy that were just really influential, that have stuck with you and have carried with you as a reader, as a person. I'd love to talk with you more about that. So please feel free to let me know what you thought about my list in the comments below, and then give me your own too, so I can engage you in the comics. If you like this top 10 list, I'd be happy to, there's lots of these sort of things happening. Typically, I like to unpack a number of reviews of sort of lost classics of fantasy, horror, and science fiction. So today was obviously some fantasy works, some of which, Lawrence Walt Evans or, or, Fred Saberhagen may not be on a lot of to modern readers and so forth. So help you get caught up with some of those names. That's, again, part of the point of this channel. Also, if you spend some time with this video, and it's almost been an hour, I appreciate that you took some time out of your day to invest with me and so forth, and spend some time with me. It's very humbling that you spent time with me and watched this whole video, even though we have such busy days and busy lives and so forth. And if you liked it, please feel free to hit the subscribe button and so forth. Anyway, you have a great day and have a good one.